your Bibles to 1 Chronicles chapter 22, verse 14. Verse 14 reads, "Now behold, in my trouble, I prepare for the house of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000,000 talents of silver, and of brass and iron, without weight, for it is in abundance. Timber also and stone have I prepared, and thou mayest add thereto." Now, what David is referring to in this chapter is his preparation for the temple, which he never got to build. His son did, Solomon, but he wasn't able to do it for reasons which I'm not going to get into tonight, but his son Solomon did. When you read this verse, you could read through the numbers real quick. And because the numbers are so large, it just goes right by you. What this one individual is able to accumulate. David was the richest man in the world, not just in his day, but any day prior to his existence and any day after, including even now. What's that Amazon guy's name? Jeff Bezos or whatever his name is? I'm sorry. He doesn't even come close, and he's the richest man in the world today to David's wealth. David accumulated all this wealth, and he left behind the greatest fortune. And it's kind of ironic, if you haven't heard me teach it, there's a message that you send it up ahead if given is done correctly and properly. You send it up ahead. Obviously, it's going to be accumulating rewards. And if you haven't listened to the giving series, it's different than most. I recommend that you do. It's the Where Is Your Heart series. It's in the video format on the website, and also you can find it in print on the website. I encourage you. Even though David left it all behind, he really sent it all up ahead because he was laying up his treasures up in heaven. And he was able to accumulate this mass fortune, a fortune that's never been amassed before his time and never since his time by any one man on the planet Earth. I have taught on this series, if you haven't heard the other, I think it's 4 or 5 messages that I preached on David, we talked about him being a servant of God, a real servant of God. Even though he had ups and downs, even though he had moments in his life where he's living in the flesh, when push came to shove, he was a man after God's own heart. And he was a willing servant of God for the things of God. And he understood, even though he accumulated this mass fortune, he really didn't own anything. Nothing at all, because he knew it all belonged to God in the first place. He understood that not only himself, but everything that he owned was controlled by God. And that's why we could call David a real servant. That and for other reasons, but we're just focusing on the physical, material things of this world in his day, gold, silver, and so forth. So his attitude, everything that he had was the Lord's. And quite frankly, that should be all of our attitudes. In 1 Corinthians 6, I believe it's the 19th and 20th verses, it says that we are not our own. For we've been bought at a price. And it goes on to say, therefore glorify God in your body and your spirit. And it concludes by saying, which are God's. Our body and spirit are God's. So anything that we accumulate is also God's. In 2 Corinthians, I believe it's chapter 5. It says, those who live in Christ. Not living for themselves, but living in Christ should no longer live for themselves. These are all servant attitudes that are developed because of your understanding of God's Word and what it instructs us of what we'll become once we are living in Christ. I've taught on the reward series that we all must appear, and if you haven't listened to the reward series, that's a must listen to, or I don't believe we have any of that in format yet, but it's a must listen to. We're all going to appear before the judgment seat of Christ, that we may receive the things done in this body according to what we have done, whether it's good or bad. Therefore, it should be our goal, our aim, whether present or absent, like the scripture says, to be well-pleasing to Him. Now, when you think of people of this world, like Rockefeller, Warren Buffett, Bill Gates, Jeff Bezos from Amazon, what is the first thing you usually think of when those people are mentioned in a sentence or you read something about them? If you're like most, the first thing you're going to think about concerning those individuals are things they have accumulated, which is their vast wealth and riches. That's what you're going to think about. When somebody mentions the name of Warren Buffett, oh yeah, he's that rich man. Same thing with Bezos, same thing with Rockefeller, same thing with Henry Ford. and others that have accumulated vast amount of wealth in their lifetime. Now, if you would mention another well-known person into that mix, such as David, what do you think is the first thing, or maybe the second thing, that people bring up or remember David by? Think about it. Oh, he was that shepherd boy. Or he was the one that killed the bear and the lion. Oh, he was king of Israel. He was that giant slayer. He killed Goliath. He wrote some of the Psalms. Bathsheba. Those are the things that you would bring up, or someone that had any kind of knowledge of the Bible concerning David. They would bring up those things. You think anyone would ever bring up his wealth? You think anybody in your conversation would bring up, including yourself, his riches? Probably not. However, he was far wealthier than all those individuals, the Fords, the Rockefellers, the Buffetts, the Gates, the Bezos. He was richer than all those people combined. In fact, you could double and triple the wealth, and it still wouldn't add up to the number that he accumulated. But nobody ever brings that up. Nobody ever puts two and two together. So how much wealth did David have? Is it really that much? We know that David accumulated at least 5,000 tons of gold. 5,000 tons of gold. You go to 1 Chronicles 22:14 again. Let's read it. Now behold, in my troubles I have prepared for the house of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold, 1,000 talents of silver, and of brass of iron without weight, for it is in abundance. Timber and also stone have I prepared. He had 5,000 tons, not ounces, 5,000 tons of that yellow metal called gold. Let me read you something about gold. There are many physical aspects of the yellow metal which are truly amazing. Gold is the most malleable, which means able to be hammered into very thin sheets, and able to be drawn into a fine wire of all metals. It is so malleable that a goldsmith can hammer 1 ounce of gold into a thin, translucent wafer covering more than 100 square feet, only 5 millionths of an inch thick. One ounce of gold can be drawn into a wire 50 miles long. Furthermore, only 1 ounce of this marvelous metal is required to plait a thread of copper 1,000 miles long. Gold is also one of the heaviest metals known. It has a specific gravity of 19.3, which means it weighs 19.3 times as much as the equal volume of water. Therefore, 1 cubic foot of gold weighs 1,206 pounds, more than a half a ton. More unbelievable than its physical characteristics, is its scarcity. It is well documented that the world's holdings accumulated during all recorded history to the present is only about 120,000 metric tons. Understandably, it is rather difficult for the average person to relate to this measurement. Suffice it to say that the total world's hoard of the shining metal will occupy a single cube 60 feet by 60 feet by 60 feet, which is equivalent to the approximate volume of 3 12-room homes. This is indeed a small volume of matter to have influenced the toil and destiny of so many people since biblical days. In fact, the total world's holdings of the rare metal could be transported by a single oil tanker. That's if Lloyd's of London would ever accept the insurance risk on this priceless cargo. The value of this priceless cargo would be approximately $2.2 trillion. Now, this was written when gold was about $500 an ounce. It's more than 3 times that amount now. So this would be more like $7 trillion. How much is 5,000 tons of gold? How much? The Bible says it is 100,000 talents. If you could compare that total to the amount that we have here in the United States of America in a federal building somewhere in Kentucky called Fort Knox, they only have 4,600 tons, supposedly. Who knows? Which, according to the government records, is about 147 million ounces. Supposedly, under very controlled and careful guard. And supposedly, now, I think China has made a run for our money, and they might even have more than us now. But supposedly, we are still the largest accumulator of gold reserves of any nation on this earth. Which means the largest pile of gold sitting anywhere is 4,600 tons approximately here in the United States of America. Now, 3,000 years ago, David exceeded all the wealth in gold and became the richest person in the richest nation in the history of the planet Earth at that time. And David exceeded the Fort Knox holdings of gold reserve. Which means, if you put it in perspective, that David had almost 1 million more pounds of gold than supposedly we have here in the USA. Now, let me read you something else. If you dig into the commodities market, you will find the following facts in the endless tables of records kept in the precious metal archives. In all the history of the world, to 1835, there was at the most a total of 20,000 tons of gold ever produced. Now, David, 3,000 years ago, what they have calculated is no more than 10,000 tons of gold on the planet. So, at the very least, David held at the end of his life and what he passed on to Solomon, half or possibly even more of all the wealth on this planet. David's gold was worth approximately $275 billion in today's commodity markets. Commodity markets. In his day, his wealth exceeded half of all the monetary gold value of the entire planet. And I have written down here some of the economists today say that the sum total of all monetary wealth in the world is in the realm of $250 trillion. That is loans, stocks, bonds, deposits, etc. So, if we're going to do a comparison in the world of 2020 and looking back at what David accumulated, when you add all those figures together, they would be worth over $400 trillion. I don't know about you, but that is wealthy. That's not even super rich. That's beyond that. But we don't know David for that reason, do we? Nobody mentions David being the richest man in the world that ever existed. His wealth was staggering. It's a number out there that's even hard to believe. But no one ever thinks him as a wealthy individual unless you start studying this part of his life. And this part of his life is an attribute of what David's spirit was like, which God used because he was a willing servant to be used of God, and God blessed him with many victories, he was able to accumulate a lot of riches from those victories. And now David could have just kept it all to himself, be prideful about what he accomplished, and give God no credit. We knew David, even though he was a servant of God, he fell to temptations. But what he did with his wealth was not one of them. If you ever wonder why David's wealth, if you ever looked into this subject before, and I did, if you wonder why his wealth was usually never thought about, I guess we already touched on the answers in the giving series, Where's Your Heart? Because the assets of all God's servants usually follow the words of their master. And we already know what those words are. We've covered these words before. Matthew 6:19 and onward in those verses. What do those verses say? Do not lay up for yourselves treasures on earth. Why? Because moth and rust will destroy and thieves will break in and steal it. He goes on to say, but lay up treasures for yourselves. And there's where the inexhaustible rewards come in. I'm sorry? It says, Some people don't want to acknowledge that, but Christ has given you the opportunity to lay up treasures for yourself, which He will bless you and reward you with inexhaustible riches throughout eternity for being obedient and being faithful and being a willing servant to use what God has given you as a funnel for the cause of Christ. But lay up for yourselves treasures in heaven. That's what He says. And moth and rust have no effect on those treasures over there. And they won't be able to be stolen from you. It goes on to say, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. James goes on to say, for what is your life? It's even as a vapor for a little time, and then it vanishes. What are you going to do with it? In 2 Corinthians it says, for the things which are seen are just temporary. The things which are not seen are eternal. All these concepts, if you listen through the Where Is Your Heart series or read through the series, are not going to be new to you. These are the same concepts that I preached on over and over and over. David had that same attitude. It's like that song, all I have belongs to you, for all I have comes from you. That's how David thought. The rest of the song goes, nothing I own, nothing I possess is by my own hands, it's by my own hands, it's by your faithfulness. So please take this offering from a heart of thanksgiving, for you've given all I have. So what does God's servants do with their treasures? David didn't follow a formula. David didn't follow a 10% formula. He realized it's all God's. I'm not saying you give everything. But I've said many times, you don't need a governor to control what you give either. You are to give hilariously. You have been looking for the opportunities to share your material things for the cause of Christ. Just like David, we all should give back to God. It's His anyway. David was God-hearted, which meant he served God's purposes. David was under God's command. Oh, He gave him room for error. And that's why you see some failures in his life. But he always did what the Lord asked him to do. And he always wanted the Lord to get all the glory. He was truly His servant all of his days. That's why Paul uses that same concept to describe his own life and ministry. These were individuals that were God's servant. And David's, outside of Joseph, is one of the most written persons concerning their life that we find in the Scriptures. His life as God's servant was on display for all to see for now thousands of years. Now behold, in my trouble I have prepared for the house of the Lord 100,000 talents of gold, and 1,000 talents of silver, and of brass and iron without weight. For it is in abundance. Timber and also stone I have prepared. He also says in 1 Chronicles 18 that he dedicated all these to the Lord. He made this a lifelong habit, friends. And in return, God gave him great victories, and he was able to accumulate greater and greater riches. And he just kept giving them back to the Lord. Makes you wonder what God could do with any individual that has that same attitude. Let me read you something else. David poured his life out as an irrecoverable offering because he believed that God deserved the best. Once David longed for the sweet water he had drank as a child that was now behind enemy lines. His mightiest warriors fought to the well of Bethlehem, drew water, fought their way back, and presented the water to David. David amazed them and actually poured the water on the ground. David poured out the water to the Lord as a drink offering. A drink offering poured out was never recoverable, as the ground absorbed every drop. So David gave to the Lord irrecoverably what was most precious to him. David poured out the water from the well of his childhood, just like the treasures of his career, because David believed that God deserved the best of his time, treasures, and talents. David wanted to make sacrifices for God because he knew God deserved that which was costly. The prophet Gad told David what God expected, a sacrificial offering on Mount Moriah. David went to the spot and the owner offered to give David everything he needed. David would not take the threshing floor without paying the full price. David would not give to God that which cost him nothing. You can read the story in 2 Samuel 24. It's 18 through verses 25. And when you get to the end of David's life, what did he do with all those treasures? What did he do with what he accumulated? He had a purpose for it. He had a desire for it. He wished he could have had it done in his lifetime. But he couldn't. He had too much blood in his hands. And that was reserved for his son to build the temple of the Lord and everything that was in that temple. And that's why we've been reading several times tonight 1 Chronicles 22:14, where he took the time and trouble to prepare for the house of the Lord. And he prepared with all his might in 1 Chronicles chapter 29. His passion, his strength, his might was focusing on preparing what God would eventually have build. What he eventually would have build. And eventually did, by his son. All the gold, all the silver, all the bronze, all the iron, the wood, stones, all of it accumulated by David. Why? Because if you go to 1 Chronicles 29, verse 3, it reads, "Because I have set my affection on the house of my God. I have given to the house of my God over and above all that I have prepared for the holy house." And it goes on to say, "My own special treasure of gold and silver." He believed that God deserved the best. He believed that the sacrifices were necessary for God because he knew God deserved what was costly. David just didn't give what he accumulated in the treasury that he didn't use. He also gave what was his special treasures. You'll hear many messages preached about David. He was a man after God's heart. And they talk about all the different reasons why. But it's a shame that how many messages are preached on this subject. It's rare to find one of the attributes about David and why he was a man after God's own heart. And as I read and I preached to you the things that you've heard tonight, it comes down to one thing. He was a giver. He had a passion to please his master. He understood that he was not his own. He was bought with a price. Even though that scripture didn't come until the New Covenant days, he understood the principle. He was not his own. God owned him, and God owned everything that he had. And he understood that he was just a funnel. He was just the instrument that God could use because he was a willing servant that made himself available for God's purposes. One last thing I want to read to you. Probably, and I've read this before, probably every one of us have heard about this famous life motto that the great missionary Charles Thomas Studd, who lived between 1860 and 1931, lived and died by this saying: "Only one life will soon be past, and only what's done for Christ will last." However, few of us realized when it was said that he was on his deathbed with his family gathered around him. He already told all of his children that he wished he had something to give, but he had nothing left. He said, "I gave it all to Jesus long ago." The best thing you can leave your children is a testimony of your life as a willing servant of Jesus Christ. When Avis B. Christensen, the wife of the vice president of Moody Bible Institute, heard these precious words spoken by C.T. Studd at his death, she began to ponder them. A few years later, in 1937, she wrote a famous hymn, "Only One Life to Offer." Listen to her reflections that turned into a prayer of devotion to the Lord. She also served with all her heart. And it goes like this. Only one life to offer, Jesus, my Lord and King. Only one tongue to praise thee, and of thy mercy sing. Only one heart's devotion, Savior, or may it be consecrated alone to thy matchless glory, yielded fully to thee. Only this hour is mine, Lord, may it be used for thee. May every passing moment count for eternity. Souls are all about our dying in sin and shame. Help me bring the message of Calvary's redemption in thy glorious name. Only one life to offer. Take it, dear Lord, I pray, nothing from thee withholding. Thy will I now obey. Thou who hast freely given thine all in all for me, claim this life for thine own to be used, my Savior, every moment for thee. And that's where David stood. Every moment for thee. Yes, he had some heartaches. Yes, he had some times where he totally went off the rails. That's what the flesh does when you allow the flesh to do the things that it desires. When push came to shove, though, he recognized when he went off the rails, and he would say, unto thee, O God, I have sinned. And he would have that change of mind moment and come back to the Lord. To get back on the track. To get back to be that willing servant. To get back to be that obedient servant that can be used by him. He was a man after God's own heart for many different reasons. But we should never neglect one amazing reason why God looked upon David like he did, and why he's in the Hebrews chapter 11 list of heroes of faith. Because he was a willing servant that recognized that everything belonged to God, and whatever he can do as the wealthiest man that ever lived on this planet, then and now, he would do. He would not hold back. There's people listening tonight that still haven't participated. And they've been listening for years. Maybe you could take the example that we read concerning David's life and start applying to your own life. Everybody wants to be like Jesus or in the image of Christ. Well, God sent. That means he gave us his only begotten Son. And Jesus gave up his life. God and Jesus. Do I have to point it out to you? What they gave does not even compare to anything that we could accumulate here on this earth. Jesus gave up his seat in glory for a time to come and die and save us by the pouring out of his blood and the being a willing servant to have his body broken and torn apart by men that he knew someday he would have to save them in the future. From eternal destruction. Which, if you've been listening to the Lake of Fire teaching, there really is no eternal destruction. But those same people that will have to go through the fire and purified because they missed out willingly of the first opportunity. By trusting and having confidence and faith in him and what he's done for us. Those people are not going to have the opportunities that we have now if you start putting your faith in Christ. And by the way, there's plenty of promises, even though when you think you have nothing right now. You have more than most. If you come to have a change of mind concerning Jesus, and now He's your Savior. That's a wonderful foundation to start your journey in faith, your life in Christ, as a willing servant. A man that had everything, far as wealth is concerned, recognized it meant nothing if he didn't have God. It meant nothing if he couldn't give it back to God willingly. David was a man after God's own heart. Like I said, for many reasons. But never exclude the fact that he was the wealthiest giver that will ever exist on this planet. Outside of Christ. I've heard Christians in my lifetime say, well, if you're rich, you never can get to heaven. Tell that to David. It's that much more difficult because you start clinging on to your riches. And the more you accumulate, the more you hang on tighter. And you miss out on the opportunities to accumulate true riches. Riches that surpass anything that you accumulate here. I don't care if it's 5,000 tons of gold or 10,000 tons of gold. The poorest man giving, hilariously, will accumulate more than anything anybody has ever accumulated in this earth combined. That's why we lay up our treasures up in heaven. And they're not destructible. They're non-destructible. And they're inexhaustible. We are sitting towards the end of this month, and we're close to the goal. Let's push forward and achieve this goal this month. But more importantly, give for the right reasons. Give with a pure heart that God sees. He knows the reasons why you're giving. Don't give grudgingly. Give hilariously. Look for the opportunities. See if God does not make you a funnel once He sees you're a willing servant. Many of you probably could testify to that now because you're already givers the way the Scriptures define givers should be like. The attributes what true givers have obtained through the knowledge and understanding what God expects through His Word. Now, I just wanted to point that out. Something that's not really pointed out by anyone, how rich David was. And he gave it all away. He didn't take it to the grave. He sent it up ahead for the purposes in the here and now, but more importantly, for his treasures that he was accumulating in heaven. It's an amazing story once you put the figures together and see that other aspect of David that really nobody really talks about or preaches about. Well, As we dig into what David's heart was all about, we cannot exclude the giving nature that he had, that he practiced, that he passionately made a part of his life, because that is how important God was to him. And besides his failures, and even though all of his victories, probably the greatest victory he ever had in his lifetime was his last act of giving everything he had to God, to be used by him. Now, I'm not saying for you to give everything you have and you have nothing on to buy your next meal tomorrow. Just have a David giving attitude, that you don't want to hold back what God has so blessed you with. You don't have to be super wealthy to receive the inexhaustible rewards in heaven. You think the two mites is going to be any less acknowledged? The woman that gave the 2 mites going to be any less acknowledged in the judgment seat of Christ than David? No. It's about your heart. That's why you should listen to the series, Where is Your Heart? Well, I already listened to it. I already read it. You should do it at least once a year to remind yourself of why it's important to give the right way, God's way, and not all this other silly stuff you see, televised or in print. Giving to God the right way, which is the only way. Now, I want to hear from you. Play a song.